Sustainable You is a casual, interactive, yet informative series detailing and cataloging the sustainability experience. Moreover, this is a short podcast docuseries detailing the thoughts and experiences of passionate advocates towards all things eco-friendly. Our journey is to know how and why understanding sustainable development towards the triple bottom line of people, profit, and planet can contribute to a more mindful, holistic, and inclusive world. Specifically, this podcast showcases what makes you a changemaker, innovator, and transformer as you tackle sustainability challenges for current and future generations to resolve the so-called wicked problems. So today, we do an in-depth spiel of the so-called Anthropocene. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Anthropocene is a geological epoch believed to have emerged due to human-driven changes to the Earth's composition and operation, particularly the climate system. In terms of climate change, some detractors of the Anthropocene claim that it ignores alternatives, that is, there is no direction on how to genuinely maintain human progress within the ecological bounds of the planet, and rather that it supports a weak sustainability agenda and green growth using the disputed terminology of the SDGs and climate action. Consequently, it normalizes the capitalist industrial complex as the only viable option for humanity. Economic growth and ecological modernization result in technological solutions to biodiversity loss and human life, especially that which is consistent with the capitalist mindset, is prioritized over the planet's other flora and fauna. So to understand more about this phenomenon, I had a conversation with American academic Earl Ellis from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, who teaches geography and environmental systems focusing on human landscape ecology for sustainable biosphere stewardship. According to Ellis, the term and its authentic meaning have been contested and given numerous interpretations over the years, with the term originally being coined in 2000 to describe the impact of human societies on the environment. However, the Subcommission of Quaternary Stratigraphy rejected the idea in 1952, disregarding the overwhelming evidence of human society's global changes. Stay tuned to learn more on what the Anthropocene entails.
I'm Earl Ellis, and I'm a professor of geography and environmental systems at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. And my research focuses largely on global changes in ecology caused by using land.
Okay, great. And then for that, actually, we usually get participants to play like a fun, like quick icebreaker, if you don't mind playing it. And then you just choose one adjective basically from the list. And we don't mean to typecast your persona as being type A or B or anything like that. But we want to get to know like your nature, your persona in regards to your vocation and as your researcher in environmental sciences and geography. So yeah, that would be great.
Okay. All right. Going down the list here. Definitely not docile. Naughty. Sassy. Boy. Gosh, that's a hard one. Yeah, I'm describing myself, which is always a tricky thing to do. I guess I would go for, I'll go for hardy.
Okay. Okay, I haven't gone that one. Why would you choose that word?
I would choose the word hardy because a lot of my work involves going up against prevailing views, and you have to kind of stick with things to do that. It takes time, it takes persistence. So I'll choose
okay, that's a good one. Okay, I haven't gone that one yet, so that's good. I think Canadians especially tend to choose like more laid back. So, but I like that, hardy. That's pretty cool. So, what makes you uncertain and what makes you curious?
What makes me uncertain? What makes me curious? Gosh, That's so general. I have a hard time answering that one. What makes me curious is anything I don't understand, obviously makes me curious. What makes me uncertain? Well, I think that uncertainty is kind of a constant state of mind. I don't really I try to remain a little bit uncertain.
Okay. I guess that's important. As like a researcher, you need to be
It's
uncertain
very
in that
important.
sense. Yeah.
Because
Okay.
I found that certainty usually gets in the way of actually understanding the real world because we are not capable of being certain. People who think they're certain are usually wrong.
Right. No, that's a good point. And does anything make you curious?
Like I said, anything I don't understand generally can make me curious. It doesn't take much. I'm curious about a lot of things.
Okay, great. Okay, great. Thanks for sharing. And so tell us more about yourself, your struggles, your aspirations and contributions that led you to getting involved in, I guess, geography, environmental sciences, and landscape ecology.
Well, I think from a young age, I was interested in kind of big questions about sustaining human societies. I grew up in the 70s and 80s when there was a lot of concern about not about climate change at that time. There was a lot of concern about nuclear war being a potential thing. I grew up in Washington, D.C., which was obviously target number one for any kind of nuclear war. And there was a concern. It's funny, it gets expressed a lot by people like Elon Musk these days as this concern about the potential vulnerability of human societies and the need to be kind of multi-planetary. And that meant something to me back then in the same way that it did to Musk. That was my kind of childhood thinking. But as I moved further into my career, which was at the in the university, was mostly about agricultural sustainability, agricultural production, and how to sustain that, it became very obvious to me that the challenge wasn't, finding some other planet to spread out the human species on. But the really important thing was finding ways to live on Earth in more sustainable ways. And that there was actually a long history of that the challenges that we have at the current time are different in some ways than the age-old challenges, but also we can learn a lot from what other societies have done. And that led me to kind of another type of science where I wanted to understand better this kind of traditional sustainable practices and societies and the bigger picture of long-term planetary change caused by human societies.
Interesting. No, it's interesting how your background kind of started, and you're kind of part of that, I guess, new age environmental movement in the 70s. So it's interesting to see how you kind of
New age
transition.
has a different meaning for people from that time, right? I don't know if you are you familiar with this idea of the new age?
Not really. I mean, I think we just throw it
that was a
around.
hippie thing. That was a hippie thing in the 80s. Kind of like
Okay.
magical, mystical stuff. Obviously that stuff was around and I partook a little bit, but my main interests have usually been more scientific.
Okay.
So
Interesting.
when you talk about a new age, I would think maybe what you're thinking of is the turn toward planetary science, Earth system science, this sort of thing.
Yeah, kind of like when things like systems thinking emerged and stuff like that. I guess that would be more after the fact, but thank you for sharing, and that's great. Okay, now to get into more questions on the subject matter. So I actually wanted to know what your definition of sustainable development and sustainability is. So what is your personal definition?
Well, so I kind of cut my teeth my early days of my career, and really for, I don't know, like decade and a half, I worked a lot on sustainable agriculture, sustainable development related things. And I think what's happened with that whole approach, I mean, it's like everything, it evolves and it gets questioned. And I currently don't really think of the sustainable thinking is actually the most important framing for what we're trying to accomplish. Because the challenge of sustainability was always that it just tended to define efforts to keep what is already going on. It doesn't have a vision for change. It's all about, in some ways, trying to maintain things rather than trying to pursue something better. And that is where people, I think, are focusing now, and I'm focusing more now on transformations and processes of change that lead to better outcomes. Think of it this way. For a lot of people, things need to be improved a great deal. The idea that you would sustain the current state of affairs is not attractive to a huge amount of people. So the bar is way too low when we talk about just sustaining what we have. And we have to think more in terms of how can we shape a better future for people and the rest of nature.
Okay, great. And is there any sustainable development goals that you best advocate for? Do you still think these metrics hold merit? Because I found personally when I was in Sweden that they didn't really address that, and whereas in Canada it's very much almost like goalposts that we use. And they had mentioned at the time that's very anthropocentric, that perspective. And I agreed, because we're not really being inclusive. We're not taking that biocentric perspective, I guess, or ecocentric perspective to be inclusive of all flora and fauna. And yeah, even the term itself, sustainability, sustainable development, is a paradox. It's contradictory in that sense when you think of things like
if you think of development as something that changes things over time and that the goalposts change, then it is a little bit of a contradiction, this idea.
Mm-hmm.
But my biggest challenge with the Sustainable Development Goals is that unless you're a technocrat, unless you're somebody who really invests a great deal of time into actually even knowing what they are, it's just not something for people. It's just for experts. The Sustainable Development Goals, the idea that you'd have hundreds of goals, I mean, people have all sorts of goals, and that's fine. But the idea that kind of a framework, that we have experts that can help us with hundreds of goals, I find that it's in a sense a kind of technocracy. It's taking the vision about what it means to shape a better future away from people, because people aren't going to be able to know what all these are. How many sustainable development goals can you name? It's only going to be like, if you can name more than 10% of them, I'd be shocked. Okay, and you already know what they are. Most people don't even know what they are.
That's true.
So in terms of participatory efforts to move toward a better future, I feel like that's kind of the wrong approach. We need something more simple, something that communicates better with people than a system that includes hundreds of technical targets.
Okay. No, it's interesting to hear your perspective on that. And thanks for sharing. So we don't really talk as much about your research, but what would you say is, I guess, your research's core values and intent? I guess like the philosophy behind it. Do you want to maybe share a bit more about that?
Well, obviously that's an evolving thing. I'm not always doing the same research, or at least that's true for me. I tend to be most interested in seeking out the kind of things that I feel need to be done but aren't being done. Some people like to work on, advancing something that's already being put out there as what needs to be done. I like to kind of move the goalpost and think about what hasn't been done that needs to be done. Most recently, I'm involved in a project that is very different than a normal academic project. It's arguably not an academic project at all. It's more of a kind of social and political project. And that is this effort, what we're calling an aspirational approach to planetary futures, which again maybe has similar long-term, goals as something like sustainable development goals, but it's designed to be much simpler and more accessible, which is just the ability to define some very simple, I wouldn't call them values, we call them aspirations for what it means to have a better future, not just for the human world, but for the rest of life on Earth. And I'm a firm believer that people already have a great deal of value for the rest of life. It's not just about the human world. People really do care about the wildlife, and people care about nature in general. And so what we're trying to do is to actually kind of firm up what does it mean to have progress, development that actually improves conditions, not just for people, but also for the rest of life on Earth. We're trying to do it in a sense, the simplest way possible, which is not a typical scientific thing to do necessarily, right? We're not scared of complexity, lots of dimensions, lots of complexity, but from the point of view of working with people more generally, simplicity is fundamental.
Okay, great. Well, it's definitely interesting to get your insights on the type of research that you do. I know you also recently released a book, so you can also maybe talk more about that towards the end. But for viewers who have never heard of the term, or maybe it's a bit vague to them, what is the Anthropocene and why is it considered a new geological era? And what's your definition of it, I guess?
Okay, well, the Anthropocene is a term that emerged spontaneously in some discussions among Earth scientists. These are people who study global atmospheric change and this sort of thing, as a kind of way of recognizing that the planet's conditions are no longer just operating without human societies. Human societies are now changing the climate, changing the atmosphere, changing biology, changing all these aspects of the way the Earth functions. And so the goal of naming this, the Anthropocene, a human age, or actually technically a human epoch in Earth history, was to recognize that we have entered this time in which human societies are transforming the planet. You can't understand what the future of the planet will be without understanding what people are going to do. What will the temperature be in 50 years? The number one question to answer that is, what will human societies do, not what the physics of the planet are. So that the Anthropocene has originally represented.
Okay, great. And in your article, you address how the coin term has changed over the past handful of decades. Do you want to explain more?
Well, I mean, you can probably tell if you search for the term on the internet, you will see so many meanings attached to the Anthropocene that I can say with confidence that it means many, many things to many people. It's out there in the arts and humanities and popular music. It's still very active in the sciences as well. It's in the social sciences, humanities. It's all over the place. And so it's come to mean many things. And think of it this way. When we're talking about a human age in the Earth, that gets a lot of people interested in defining what does it even mean to be human? What kind of hubris is it to name a time in Earth history after ourselves? All these kinds of issues come up. At the same time, the term in the sciences has a technical meaning just based on how the word is constructed in Latin. It literally means the epoch of the human epoch. An epoch is a particular type of geologic time unit. For example, a lot of people have heard of the Pleistocene, which is a time when there were many different types of species that aren't around today. The Holocene is actually the currently defined epoch that geologists define of the last, it's basically the time since the last ice age. It's about 12,000 years. Okay, that's technically the term. But Anthropocene is this idea that Holocene is ended and we're now in this human age beyond that. This was something that was considered for official definition by geologists in what's called the geologic time scale, which is how these time intervals are officially defined. And it was rejected, fully rejected. Almost every person in the group that voted on it rejected this term, and not rejecting the idea that people are transforming the planet, but rejecting the idea that this was a usefulizing geologic time. And it was for a variety of different reasons, one of which was the Anthropocene is used in many different ways. And the idea that it would be defined very narrowly, in this case, with a start time in 1952, very hard to explain to people, that this narrowing of the definition of this human age, you called it an era. These are all actually terms that are technical in geology. Era and age and epoch are all different time units. But in this technical term, they decided this wasn't a useful definition for the geologic time scale. But it has nothing to do with the reality that we live in a time when the planet is being transformed by people. It just had to do with how useful was it for geologists to recognize a new epoch in their geologic time scale. That was what was rejected.
Okay, interesting. Okay, thank you for the clarifications. So how, just going a bit more into this, how does the concept of the Anthropocene relate to the climate change crisis and other environmental issues? So I'm sure you've heard of things like weak sustainability versus strong sustainability. And of course, weak sustainability is, again, really relying heavily more on technological advancement to resolving everything. And again, strong sustainability is more, again, adopting that ecocentric perspective, the genuine preservation of biodiversity.
Well, here's a very simple question for anyone who's calling the climate situation a crisis. Will this still be something that your children are going to need to deal with? The answer is yes. This is a generational process. We need to transform the energy systems of societies around the world in order to produce a carbon neutral energy system. That's not something that can be done in 10 years. Yet you hear this endless drumbeat of narratives about how we have 12 years to address the crisis. I've been hearing that for 30 years. It is not motivating. It's depressing. The number one message from these kinds of crisis narratives, like we have passed a 1.5 degrees threshold, which we have and will pass as being a crisis, all it proves to people is that human societies have failed to deliver a better future. That is a disempowering narrative that makes you not want to invest in efforts to change the situation, which we can do and will not happen immediately. It takes a lot of time to change these things. And I have to say, from my perspective, being an older person and having been involved in this for 30 years, is that 30 years ago, there was no cheap alternative to burning fossil fuels, and now there is. There's a lot of cheap alternatives, and things are changing actually much faster than they used to for many different reasons. And so just endlessly framing planetary change as this kind of crisis that we can end in some kind of like simple fashion is not understanding the real condition of the Anthropocene. Human societies and social change are connected with the functioning of this entire planet. When human societies change, the planet changes. It doesn't just change for the worse, it can also change for the better. There was a time when there were no environmental protection agencies. There was a time when there was no protection for endangered species, no protected areas, no environmental cleanups. All these things are addressing these challenges. And of course, we need to do much better than what we're doing now if we want to have a better future. But the idea that somehow all we have is a crisis, an unmitigated crisis, is not actually very motivating and empowering of the forces in human societies that can end and reverse these kinds of challenges. So I do have a different feeling about the use of crisis narratives as a way to motivate the kinds of changes that we need.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. It's definitely fear-mongering when we see it from that perspective, and know that you have a good point on that as well. Yeah, so I guess you kind of spoke a bit about that. So for this next question asks, so how does the Anthropocene challenge, I guess, the traditional views of the human-nature relationships? So I guess what do you understand by the term Anthropocene, and how does it relate to the challenges we face today?
Okay. Well, with this kind of human nature narrative, the simplest thing to say about that is there's so many of them. There's so many ways that people think about people's relationships with nature, from the kind of classic Western model of there's humans and then there's nature, this kind of separation model, which has always been kind of a straw man. People have, animals have been part of nature forever, and we're animals, and Darwin has proven that a long time ago. So that's a scientific fact. So if we're animals, then obviously we're part of nature. So this stuff just kind of gets talked about endlessly. But in reality, we've always been and always will be part of nature. But there's always these arguments that's we need to address that kind of thinking. And I do think that it is important to always recognize that we are part of nature, and what we're doing is changing nature in this way or that way. But the critical thing I think that Anthropocene brings up that's already out there, but it helps to bring that up, is the idea that there really is no separation between what human societies are doing and the way the planet is operating. These two things are inherently one thing now, and you can't really separate them. So what we do really does matter. There's no separation between what human societies do and what happens to nature. They're completely integrated. Whether that's a new idea, I don't think so. I think a lot of societies have always thought that way. So it's just another version of that at a planetary scale.
Okay. Yeah, no, it's a good point about kind of, I guess, bridging that divide with the dualism that you mentioned. And I agree, they are really symbiotic and they do affect each other in that sense. And just on this next one, so what are the different perspectives on the Anthropocene, and I guess what are like the main points of disagreement? I know you had started to mention that, but if you want to go more in depth, that would be good.
Well, like I said, I think there's almost as many perspectives on the Anthropocene as there are people. One of my favorite things is, like, I've been involved in this for decades, and I still regularly hear people just announce that the Anthropocene means this, and I've never heard it before. It's like a completely new interpretation. I hear this all the time. So the Anthropocene, it's actually almost like a jumping off point for a discussion about something. It doesn't necessarily limit the discussion. Now, that's not true of what happened with the geologic time effort to formally define the Anthropocene in geologic time. That was an effort to actually narrow down the definition. And that would have changed things to some degree, especially in the sciences. In the sciences, we would be required to use the official definition in all of our published work because editors would make us do it. And that would have said that the Anthropocene begins in 1952. 51 is not the Anthropocene, it's the Holocene. It's a different time in Earth history. So that would have really been a kind of shock for a lot of scientists who didn't realize that that was even possible to have a definition like that. But that's how the geologic time is constructed. It does have these boundaries in it. Now, most of them don't come down to a single year like that, and so that's a bit unusual. None of them are anywhere near as short. Like the shortest epoch in the time intervals so far is the Holocene at 12,000 years. That's considered incredibly short. The Pleistocene is the next shortest one, and that's 2.6. So getting down to like a 70-year geologic time interval is so many orders of magnitude different than all the others that it was one reason why they didn't see it as useful. It doesn't really work with geologic time, which is generally in these much longer units.
Okay.
So that would be the only change in the narrative. But like the Anthropocene can mean almost anything. It gets these kind of parallel terms like capitalocene, one thing I think that is important to recognize, and something that has bothered me when I hear it, I feel like there's two misuses of the Anthropocene. One is whenever you talk about people doing anything with anything, like people push a pencil across the table, that interaction is the Anthropocene because a person is doing something with something. That's not the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is about when things are thought of in a planetary scale, like truly planet-changing processes. That's the Anthropocene, not just anthropogenic or human-caused things. It's just a misuse, right? It just like everything that people do is the Anthropocene. It's like, not really. That's not a useful use of the term Anthropocene. And the other misuse, which I find much more insidious, and even I find myself doing it without thinking, so you have to correct yourself in a way, is to think of the Anthropocene as having some kind of agency in itself. Like the Anthropocene is doing this. The Anthropocene is doing that. No, people are doing this. In fact, some people are doing this. It's like saying climate change is caused by humans. It's like, no, climate change is caused by humans burning fossil fuel. Climate change is caused by X or Y that people are doing. And it's not everybody. It's not our species. That whole argument that there's this kind of, our species is doing something, not correct, right? There are people, and it's usually some people, some groups of people are doing this or that. It's important to recognize the agency of those people, including ourselves. But it's not as simple as just humans are doing this. It's a human-caused crisis, blah, blah, blah. No, it's not that simple. Some people have never burned fossil fuels in their entire life and never will. Some people have never been on an airplane. In fact, that's most people on Earth. Never been in an airplane, never burned fossil fuels that way. So we have to think about the processes of planetary change in the Anthropocene as socially differentiated. It's not just humans doing it. That's also a misuse of the term Anthropocene to kind of totalize it. Just humans do this. Humans are causing climate change. Nope.
No, it's a good point to differentiate that aspect because I don't think people really think about that, and it kind of does result in disinformation for a lot of people that use it as a catch-all, I guess, term.
And it's kind of a cover-up.
Yeah, it is.
It covers up the actions of certain people. A little bit like defining the Anthropocene as beginning in 1952. Does that mean that there were no significant changes caused by human societies before 1952? What about slavery and colonialism? Definitely changed the biology of this entire planet, unquestionably, right? You go anywhere, you're going to find all these species moved around the world in this way. Huge changes in biology long before 1952. So the idea that this is some kind of boundary that is meaningful when understanding the transformation of the planet by human society is not meaningful.
Right. No, it's good to get your insight on that. I spoke a little bit about systems thinking. So how can we, I guess, apply that perspective or viewpoint to comprehend the complexity and interdependence, I guess, aspect of these natural and social systems that you mentioned, and I guess how they're intertwined. So for anyone listening out there, I guess, how can we give them a more comprehensive understanding of environmental issues by using things like systems thinking?
Yeah, systems thinking is an interesting example because it was and is still really a huge advance in thinking about the challenges of human-environment relations or society and environment relations. But let's be clear here. Systems thinking originates in engineering, not in the sciences. It originates in engineering, and then it builds through the sciences, both in ecosystem science and earth system science, right? Where you're basically treating these processes, for example, planetary change, as part of a systems approach in which you look at the linkages and the interactions between things like the atmosphere and the biosphere and the lithosphere, and human societies burning this and that affects the other part. So it does have this element of everything is connected together. And that's a very important concept for understanding these complex changes that are happening. So, for example, humans change this, or this society changes this, and then this is changing over here because it's all coupled together into a system. So that's a very important way of understanding, just like where it comes from, like a jet aircraft, right? Like the engine is doing this, and then over there the bolts are moving, and that's a problem at the systems level. The jet comes apart. There's one problem with this, though, is that systems thinking and is basically a kind of mechanistic thinking, and that's good, but it's a little bit like the planet is a machine, right? The system is like a machine. That's where it comes from. And what we find when you're getting into some of these aspects of how this machine or mechanism is operating is more complicated than a machine can ever be. It doesn't have linear interactions. Some of the interactions are very hard to predict, maybe unpredictable. And that is a kind of system where you have true unpredictable interactions, or the way that this machine operates is evolving and changing as you go. Those things are hard to put into systems theory. Systems theory is, in a sense, a little bit more kind of enlightenment reasoning, where we can understand, if we study it enough and measure things enough, we can figure out how the thing works and we can manage it. And there's another kind of thinking that's emerging, partly from the same kinds of people, is what we often call entanglement thinking. So it's, of course, all these elements are connected together and interacting, and the things that we see are these emergent patterns that happen through these interactions, but we don't necessarily have the ability to understand them or measure them. They may be beyond that. And so you have to deal with these realities that surprising realities, unpredictable realities are also necessary to understand. They simply cannot be understood as kind of like this mechanism that we eventually figure out. There's a level of unpredictable activity that needs to be thought of as inevitable.
Just on that, concepts like systems thinking and biomimicry is another one. How they affect, I guess, the circular economy, the transition to like a performance economy where things are closed loop. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think biomimicry is a kind of a fashion that has interest, but it doesn't really account for a lot of realities that are part of even ecology. But think of things like this. I mean, I do agree that it's very important to think about kind of how things operate in a limited system. Like, we don't have, unlimited supplies of everything. But there's also this limitation to that kind of limits thinking, in that it tends to create what we call zero-sum thinking. In a zero-sum game, the only way you can win is by taking something from someone else, because there's a limited amount of what everyone needs. There's a limited safe space. That is about fighting over that limited resource, where in reality, that's not the case. We can actually improve the conditions and actually have more for people, more for the rest of nature even. There are all these synergistic ways of interacting that are beyond this simple limits kinds of thinking. And that's been essential to get us where we are, with all the problems that we have too. But the idea that the future is all about limiting what societies do, rather than changing the kind of priorities and changing the way we interact with the rest of the planet and with each other, I think that's been a problem in a way to this kind of limits thinking. So, yeah, I think we need to get beyond the zero-sum environmentalism and be thinking more the positive sum, which is, increasing the pie. That's not necessarily this idea of like unlimited growth, which will immediately be something that some people will talk about when you talk about change, is that if we change the way our human systems operate and interact with the rest of the planet, that is inherently a kind of problem. And the best thing we could do is kind of push things back and limit them to what was done in the past. I think that's not really taking into account the way that human societies and their interactions with ecology have always changed. There's not really a constant here. Even the idea that nature itself is this kind of stable balance just doesn't look at what actually has been going on, right? Nature is evolving and changing, and so is the Earth system. The Earth as a system as a whole is not constant. It's always changing and evolving, and we're part of that now. The way our societies are operating and developing and changing is also in flux. We don't know where it will go. That's another part of the entanglement thing. It's not a simple system. It's changing. The very way it operates is changing. It already has changed a lot, and it's going to change a lot more in the future in ways that we can not really predict. So the idea of a kind of a predictable, safe space is not a useful approach because we don't really know what the space that we're going to live in is going to be like. And so our adaptability has more to do with, for example, the way our societies operate in terms of how they sustain people, how they treat people, matters more in some ways than some kind of fixed relationship with the environment. The safe space for human societies is not just about what the environment is doing. It's about how we're interacting with the environment.
Okay, interesting. And just on that, degrowth, and I know that was a big part of the curriculum in Sweden, but that's not something like business ethics and degrowth is something you'd never hear about in a Canadian business school. So I thought that was interesting. So do you want to talk more about how the Anthropocene contributes? And like you mentioned a little bit about it, about the whole degrowth manifesto, and it's almost like a rebuttal to like I guess the significant influence of humans on Earth systems, but it's also maybe problematic. So it's not something that's like common.
Oh, it's interesting. So what were you looking at about degrowth that I had talked about? I'm just curious. It wasn't in that Anthropocene thing, I don't think.
No, but do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, actually, I think I was just talking about that. So the concept of degrowth is a form of zero-sum thinking. It is this idea that there is a limited capability of the planet and that the whole goal is to find ways to limit human societies to fit within some kind of limited planetary space or opportunity. And so that's obviously one way to think about it, right? We could focus on trying to limit things. But number one, there's not a whole lot of interest in this. I don't think most people think of that as what they want to focus on or what they want to do. And you could say, well, who cares? They have to do it anyway. That's, I think, been some of the degrowth narrative is like, we have no choice. We have no choice. Well, alas, people do have choices and they will make choices. It's not a matter of some kind of group telling people what to do. That generally does not happen. It does not work, right? People want change. They want better conditions and this sort of thing. So the question really, at least in my mind, I think in most people's mind is, and it's something we don't think about enough, especially people who are focused on environment, is what would a better future actually even look like? There's all this talk about disasters. There's all this talk about problems and things that, could be catastrophic. And those things are not imaginary. There's some realities about heating up the planet that, we don't know exactly what will happen, but there's some really bad things that can happen. And the costs of this are huge in many forms, right? Dollars to lives. There's so many things that happen, but that's not really the big question. The idea that we can't create a much better future than the one that we're creating now, of course we can. Of course we can. We're already doing that. When you look at where the planet was headed even 10 years ago, in many ways, it's much better than it was then. You can look at the science, look at the numbers. Things are actually turning in a certain sense. The idea that they couldn't turn much more, of course they could. Now, will we do it? That's the hard part. The hard part is building that kind of social cooperation and coordination, working together toward common purposes. That is the hard thing. It's not like whether we have to fit within this planet, but can we work together to build that better planet? And that means that we have to start thinking about, what does that even mean? What would it actually mean to have a better future? That's where we should be focusing more attention, in my view, less on how do we cut off this or that, but rather, what does this better future look like? Because people generally want a better future. It's not, I mean, it's not, it sounds stupid, but it's kind of true. Like you talk to people and like, yeah, they want a better future than what they have now. What does that mean? And it needs to take into account like a hotter future is not a better future. A future without a lot of species is not a better future. We can have a better future. We can have a future that the planet doesn't heat up that much. We can have a better future where we don't cause all these extinctions. We need to just focus on making that better future. I think that's something that people want to participate in, that it motivates people. It motivates people much better than just fear of a worse future.
Okay, great. Thanks for sharing on that. And I guess for this next one, you kind of already talked about it a bit, gave us context on it. So the Anthropocene, like the period that you mentioned, and its correlation with industrial expansion are highlighted in the article that you wrote. So what alternative narratives do you see? Do you propose of any? And how does this narrative maintain this current, I guess, status quo?
So obviously there's many ways to think about the Anthropocene, and those ways are out there of all different kinds. 1952 epoch narrative basically treats, so we were talking about the narrative about the 1952 Anthropocene epoch.
Yeah.
Well, the number one thing about that 1952 epoch idea is that it's very hard to explain to people why 1952 or 1950s in general represents this big break in the history of the planet. Like, why is it that very narrow time interval? Because most people aren't familiar with this scientific concept called the Great Acceleration, which is a fact that there were a lot of planetary changes caused by human societies that accelerated around in the time after World War II, basically. So that's a fact, but it's not something that is widely understood or thought about. I think when most people think about the Anthropocene, they do think about the Industrial Revolution. The person who invented the term, at least as we know it, Paul Crutzen, he was talking about the Industrial Revolution as this kind of time where things really start to change in relation to the past. And I think that's much easier to explain to people because it's obvious, right? The industrial world is pretty different than the pre-industrial world. So that, again, that's an easy one to understand, but it's not the same as the 1952 Anthropocene. And then, of course, there's deeper Anthropocene narratives like agriculture, which, again, it's easy to understand why that's a big change in the way that people are relating to the planet. It's a huge change, right? When people become dependent on the domesticated species. But it's also not easy to define in geologic time because it doesn't happen all at once across the planet. It takes a long time to unfold across the planet. That's why it didn't get considered as a definition for the Anthropocene. And so the challenge for the Anthropocene working group that was trying to define a geologic time interval was that was how they had to define it. It had to be a global change all at once, rather than some kind of process that unfolds across the planet, not everywhere at the same time. That's why the Industrial Revolution was not used as the defining point for the Anthropocene, because it unfolds more slowly in different parts of the world. It doesn't all happen at once everywhere.
Oh, okay, I know it's definitely a multifaceted viewpoint, and it makes more sense when you reframe it that way. And just speaking more to causes and drivers, you already sort of talked about the main human activities that are, I guess, perpetuating and driving the Anthropocene. And you talked a bit about how it's impacting, climate action and activism and just environmental injustices. So how do you see human activities impacting the planet during the Anthropocene, like now and into the future? Do you have any thoughts on that? And I guess,
well, I think
industrialization, urbanization, population growth, how does that all contribute to it?
Well, I think the simplest way to think about this, and those simple ways are important because everyone can understand them, is that the functioning of this planet, including the way the climate system works, the way that evolution of species occurs, the future of life is entangled with the way that our societies operate. So when our societies change and change things, they're changing the whole planet permanently. These are powerful effects. And so we need to think, and that whole we, who's we,
yeah.
As we operate our societies, and nobody's in complete charge of humans, right? There's no control panel for planet Earth. There's no cockpit where You can control the way that human societies are interacting with the planet, right? It's this very complex social process that nobody's in charge of, right? Nobody's personally responsible for. We need to think about that as those are the forces that will shape this planet forever, for our children, for their children, for the rest of life, for the rest of Earth history. Our time is really consequential. But I think it's important to take into account that you're not, as an individual or even as a society, responsible for everything. The planet, the temperature of the planet is not something, you don't have a knob for this. You're not in control of that. What you are in control of is what you are doing yourself. What is your relationship with the planet? And actually, most significantly, what is your relationship within your society? How are you operating within your society in ways that affect that relationship with the way the planet operates? I know that's a kind of sophisticated thing to think about, but it's the place where people actually have the most agency. It's the place where you can make the most difference in how the future of the Earth operates. But don't think of it as something that is completely on you. This is a complex thing that operates through whole societies. What your society does is not what every society is doing. They're all interacting together. So it's not a simple thing. It's not a crisis that will end, right? That this is entanglement of human societies with the functioning of the planet is not going to end. It's going to continue as long as we have human societies. And so the idea that you have to fix everything right away or we're doomed, that's a really disempowering and incorrect way of thinking about this. No matter what you do, you're still going to be in this relationship with the planet. You do the right thing, you do the wrong thing. It doesn't really matter in that sense, in that it will still affect the planet. And that the solutions to a lot of today's problems will cause problems for people down the line. And that's not something you can stop that. It's impossible. It's inevitable that we are going to shape the future in ways that are both positive and negative. And I think solar power is a great example of that, in that it eliminates a huge negative consequence for future generations, right? It's eliminating a lot of carbon from the atmosphere, or potential carbon from the atmosphere. And that's a much better future that has less carbon in the atmosphere. But it's covering a lot of land with solar panels that in some cases, and it's true in the area where I am, where most of the solar, larger scale solar is going into abandoned pastures, abandoned pasture land, low value agricultural land that if it didn't have solar panels would be starting to grow forests again. That's what you see in these places when you don't have anything else to do with them. People start doing forestry. So it's a different future. And is one better than the other? There's no way to not have an influence. The question is just like, what kind of influences are we going to have? What kind of future are we going to shape? But the idea that we are somehow able to stop influencing the future of the planet, that's not an option in the Anthropocene.
Yeah, I guess you can't really anticipate that trajectory, and it's interesting to hear that viewpoint of yours.
Thanks so much for tuning in to yet another eye-opening episode of Sustainable You. Again, this is an extraordinary and engaging info series whose purpose is to make sustainable development and sustainability accessible to the average person in their quest to quench their knowledge on environmentalism. Be sure to leave your feedback by liking this week's released edition and by subscribing to this podcast. Again, any love from our followers is much appreciated. Signing off until next time.